the world has watched and our political leaders have done absolutely nothing. How will they explain this to their children, to their grandchildren? How will they explain their not only their inaction but their complicity?
And I think it's really, really important that across Europe, millions of people have mobilized, have taken to the streets, have protested at arms factories, and have called for boycotts.
You're listening to EU Watchdog Radio.
Monday, 28 October, was the deadline for South Africa to submit a detailed memorial against Israel to the International Court of Justice to establish that Israel's military actions in Gaza amount to genocide. Evidence was not missing. The South African legal submission amounts, in fact, to more than 500 pages and exposes a pattern of mass casualties in Gaza, where nearly 43,000 Palestinians have been killed since October 2023. South Africa filed the lawsuit at the end of December last year. At that time, Palestinian victims were already amounting to 23,000, about 10,000 of which were children. More than 1 year on, violence is escalating and expanding to neighboring countries, such as Lebanon. I am Marcella Via, and you are listening to EU Watchdog Radio, a podcast by Corporate Europe Observatory and Counterbalance. To give you a bit of background, the lawsuit filed by South Africa, by the end of 2023, accused Israel of violating the 1948 Genocide Convention. Being both Israel and South Africa signatories of the UN Genocide Convention gave the International Court of Justice jurisdictions to rule over the dispute. It is not a surprise that it was South Africa, a country from the global south with a past marked by colonization and brutal apartheid, to stand up against Israel. South Africa was backed by countries including Colombia, Brazil, Bolivia, Namibia, Malaysia. But what about the EU? In this episode, I spoke with Niam Nivrian from TNI and my colleague Bram Franken about the EU involvement in the genocide in Gaza and the role of the arms industry. Let's get started. Niam is co-author of a report on the EU's complicity in Israel's genocide in Gaza. The title, Partners in Crime, tells it all. One of the issues raised in the study is the EU inaction in the context of the genocide. So I have asked Niam about possible actions that the EU and its member states could have taken to stop Israel.
In terms of concrete actions, I mean, you have sanctions, you have an arms embargo, you could isolate Israel politically, you could isolate Israel economically, you could cut the Israel-European Union, the association agreement that's been in existence since the year 2000. You could cut Israeli access to European pools of money, for example. It's as if Israel has done absolutely nothing for the last year. So, for example, I'm from Ireland. We're apparently a neutral country. Our government has failed to stop US military flights passing through Irish airports, so Shannon Airport, on their way to the Middle East. We have no idea what's on those planes. For example, we don't know if there's weapons that are being transported from the US, which is the biggest arms supporter, from the US to Israel via Ireland. We could have stopped those flights, but we haven't. We have also had reports come out in recent weeks of numerous flights, Israeli flights, that we know are carrying weapons from the US, flying through Irish airspace with a stopover in Liège in Belgium and continuing on to Israel. Why have both the Irish state and the Belgian state not stopped the transit of weapons? If a bunch of journalists in Ireland can scratch a little bit and find that there has been numerous flights, but with tens of tons of explosives and weaponry on board, flying through Irish airspace, landing in Belgium and continuing on to Israel, to perpetrate a genocide, why has there been no political will to stop those flights? If you pull the support tomorrow on European political and material funding, backing, there wouldn't be a genocide, it would be over. But there's no political will to do that.
Sanctions, arms embargoes. Basically, to better understand the level of EU's complicity, we need to compare the actions that the EU could have taken with what it actually did. But why? I asked Niam about the EU-Israel relations, and she said that Israel is completely embedded in the fabric of the European Union, from the political to the economic levels. Even though Israel is not part of the institutions, it is embedded very much at the institutional level, to the extent that Israel is almost treated as a member state. Niam pulled a quote from former EU's foreign policy chief Javier Solana, who in 2009 said, quote, "Israel is closer to the European Union than any country in the world outside Europe. Israel is a member of the European Union without being a member of the institutions." End quote. The first free trade agreement between the two parties started in 1975. Back then, the EU was the European Economic Community.
In 1975, I mean, at this point, you already had an illegal occupation in place. And so at each step of the way, you had very, openly aggressive policies being enacted from Israel to keep the Zionist project going, the creation of a racist apartheid state. And at no point you have the European Union saying, maybe we should pause relations or maybe we should pull back on these relations. You actually have an entrenchment of the relations. So you go from having the free trade agreement to carving out in the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which was negotiated in 1995 and came into place in the year 2000. And that's really what gives the legal underpinning to the relationship between the EU and Israel. That agreement contains a human rights clause, which is very clear. And if there's any risk that there's human rights violations occurring, the human rights clause is very clear that the agreement needs to be paused. But that hasn't happened.
To clarify, I asked Niam for a couple of examples to better understand the relation between the EU and Israel. And she pointed out universities.
We've seen a lot about the academic boycott. Because Israeli institutions and academic institutions are so enmeshed in European university institutions. So you have, Israeli institutions, like the vast majority of universities in Israel will be able to access European Union funding for research projects. And they will often be working in collaboration with, for example, arms companies or with, the Israeli occupation forces. With a lot of the universities have Israeli occupation forces on their campuses or having bases on their campuses or carrying out research within their campuses. And they will be in receipt of European Union funding. A lot of the projects that the European Union has funded over the years would have gone towards technological advancements, digital advancements. And how do we know that that knowledge production that was funded by the European Union hasn't led to the production of, the weaponry that relies on artificial intelligence to carry out genocide on a scale that we've not seen before? Where you can a computer generates a target and then a whole apartment block is taken out because one person in that apartment block is considered a target. So you have a total erosion of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, based on this artificial intelligence computer programming, which has likely come from universities that have been in receipt of European Union funding.
I know. This sounds already shocking, but to rub salt in the wound, I have followed up by asking more about Israel's access to EU funding, which comes out from our taxes, by the way.
For this report, we looked at the projects that the European Union had approved after the 7th of October that involved Israeli entities. And we saw that in the period from the 7th of October until when we published this report, so up until the middle of May. So about 7 months or so that we looked at. 126 million euros of European Union funding went specifically to Israeli entities. And there was a massive mix of projects in that, but a lot of them were related to healthcare and health innovation and developing, these advanced health systems and all the rest of it. And there's something incredibly grotesque about the idea that European public taxpayer money would be going towards the betterment of the Israeli health system, when at the same time the Israeli army is absolutely desecrating the health system in Gaza to the point that medical care workers and the civil defense teams, hospitals have been razed to the ground. So how can we reconcile giving millions, tens of millions of European Union funding to Israel to prop up its own health system, when at the same time it is desecrating the health system of the people in Gaza? Another thing we looked at was the Israeli arms industry. So we saw that the Israel Aerospace Industries, which is one of the biggest Israeli arms companies in Israel, and also, one of the most significant on global scale, they had received 640,000 euros of European Union just in the period of time that we looked at. I'm sure they're in receipt of other European funds, but just from that particular program and that particular period of time that we looked at, they were in receipt of 640,000 euros for two different projects that they were working on, the Israel Aerospace Industries. They're one of their main areas is, and of Israeli weapons in general. A lot of the area that they've kind of scoped out for being the experts is in drones, and actually European Union buys or leases drones from Israel, for example, for the operations of Frontex in the Mediterranean Sea. But we've all seen the use of drones as weapons of war, weapons of genocide over the last number of months. And at no point has the European Union said, well, maybe we should pull the plug on this funding for the Israel Aerospace Industries at a time when they're, supplying a genocidal regime and the army of a genocidal regime. No problem, fund away, that's fine. So there's been no red lines.
The arms industry. Let's zoom in about this with my colleague Bram, because they are kind of special to the EU.
So the arms industry is not seen like an industry as any other, because governments and also the EU are regarded as a strategic partner. And this was captured a couple of years ago perfectly by a lobbyist from the arms company Raytheon, when he said, we are not vendors, we are partners. And with partners, he was talking about governments. And that also describes pretty well how the EU is seeing the arms industry. So for example, you had the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy, Borrell, who said that I am strongly convinced that the future of European defense will start from the defense industry. So there is this very clear discourse of putting the arms industry at the center of things, where it is being framed as crucial, essential for European security and defense. And that's, of course, a very comfortable position for the industry to be in, because that means it can get anything done. It just has to ask, and politicians will jump just to get things done for the industry. And this has really led to a turbocharge in militarization of the EU in the last decade. And especially this has only increased since the war in Ukraine, when high-level politicians have started calling for building a European war economy and redefine the EU as a security project.
Nevertheless, as special as it can be, the arms industry is still lobbying the EU institutions. Let's see what it has achieved over the years.
There were too many achievements of the arms industry to mention, but I will just talk about a couple. So the first major achievement of the arms lobby is that for the first time ever in 2016-17, the EU established a European Defence Fund, a fund for military research and development, which really was unprecedented. Previously, the EU never gave funding to anything which was directly related with military, and now suddenly the EU was opening its coffers, so to say, and directly giving money to military programs. That was really the first step for the defense industry, and they had been lobbying for that for years. So the European Defence Fund was established following this expert group, which was called the Group of Personalities on Defense Research. And that group, that advisory group, was heavily dominated by the CEOs of the defense companies themselves. So they were, of course, saying, what Europe needs is to have more funding for defense. And when we later looked at these programs where the money was going to those same arms companies which had been advising the EU initially. So there was a very clear conflict of interest. Lately, the focus of the defense industry has shifted somewhat, and we've seen that they have been reframing themselves as a sustainable industry, saying that only if Europe is secure, there can be sustainability, and for that reason, the defense industry should be included in these programs for sustainable finance, and should be at the forefront of receiving private and public money from the European Investment Bank, but also private banks. And this framing has even popped up in official documents from the European Commission, which has just taken the framing from the defense industry and is now putting this forward as the official policy line of the European Union. Just as an example of how much sway the defense industry has on the European Commission. And thirdly, which is also important to understand about the militarization of EU, it's not just about the money, it's also about the institutional embedding of these militarized institutions. And this started quite early. So already in 2004, there was the establishment of a European Defense Agency. Then a couple of years ago, there was a Directorate General for Defense Industry and Space. And recently, von der Leyen has announced that there will be a European Commissioner for Defense. So there is this very strong embedding of institutions which openly state that their aim is to support the arms industry, are being more and more institutionalized in this whole European framework.
This sounds like quite a lot to take in. So when we talk about the arms industry and its lobbying on the EU, what is its estimated lobbying budget? Sit tight. Bram gave an overview.
So these companies do spend substantial resources on lobbying the EU. So if you look at the 20 biggest EU arms companies, together they spend close to 10 million euros on lobbying a year. If you look at one specific company, Airbus, you can see that it really has privileged access to the institutions. So Airbus is one of the companies with the most meetings with EU officials of the European Commission. They have had more than 300 meetings, and they're spending almost 2 million euros a year on lobbying. And they're everywhere. This is a company which is clearly very powerful and is able to shape the agenda. And just to give an example of how powerful it is, I already mentioned the European Defense Agency, which was established in 2004. And that agency was actually came into existence after another expert group where also the defense industry was included. And a couple of years, so in the end, the defense agency was established, created. And a couple of years later, a lobbyist of Airbus said at a closed meeting that the European Defense Agency was for 95% the baby of Airbus. So maybe there was some bragging involved, but that shows that the industry sees itself capable of even setting up new European institutions.
I will quote Bram from an article he wrote in 2017. He said that the military technology that is developed now will shape the wars in the future. A few years later, we are witnessing a live-streamed genocide. A question arises. How is the European arms industry involved in the genocide in Gaza?
So, first of all, I think there is something important about the war in Gaza, which should be mentioned, and that is that it's a very technologically advanced war. So you have a lot of drones are being used. It's a very high-tech kind of conflict, and Israel is using artificial intelligence to target people, and we know how unreliable that is. But the use of AI really increases the capacity of Israel to target way more targets than it used to be. For example, the tech company Palantir, which is an American company, is heavily involved in supporting the AI capabilities of the Israeli army. And Palantir even went as far to publish in a newspaper that they stand by Israel, whatever it does. So that's the first thing. So we see a lot of industrial interests coming together, the technology sector, but also, of course, the arms industry. And in Europe, so the first thing which stands out is that Europe is the second most important arms supplier to Israel. So, of course, the United States is the largest arms exporter to Israel, but Europe comes second, and that is already noteworthy. And if you zoom in, Germany is by far the largest exporter of weapons to Israel, but also Romania, France, Italy, the Czech Republic, and Spain have all delivered weapons during the last couple of years. And some of these weapons are being used in the violence in Gaza. So Germany, for example, has delivered the engines of tanks and armored vehicles, which are now being used in the genocide in Gaza. And also several EU member states deliver part and components, which are then integrated in American weapon systems, which are also used in Gaza. So there is, for example, the F-35 fighter jets, which are used to bomb. There are the Hellfire missiles, the Apache helicopters, the F-16s. So a whole range of highly advanced weaponry developed by the United States but supported by the European arms industry.
But how is this possible? I mean, is there any rule regulating arms exports? And if there is there any ethical component to it?
So there is an EU common position on arms exports, which kind of set the rules on when a EU member state has to refuse a license. And those rules are actually quite clear. There are 8 criteria. And one of the criteria is if there is a risk of weapons being used to commit war crimes or violations of international humanitarian law, then a member state should refuse that license. So actually the rule is not that bad, but the problem is that almost no EU member state complies with their own rules. So even though there is a framework in place, we see over and over and over again that the interests of the arms industry take precedence over those of human rights and international humanitarian law.
If we put together the information from both Niam and Bram, the whole picture is quite grotesque, because the EU is not only not taking political action to condemn Israel's genocide in Gaza, it is selling weapons and weapon components to Israel. And it is also granting Israel access to EU funds for militarization and research. Let's hear Bram's take on this.
So in 2007, the EU set up a program, a research program on security research. And this was shortly after 9/11, and there was this whole boom of the security industry where technology was gonna stop terrorism. And the EU wanted to pour billions and billions of euros into the security research program. And this was actually one of the first successes of arms industry lobbying. So there have been lobbying for defense research for years, but the EU wasn't ready to do that. So instead of having a military program, they set up a security research program with a lot of dual-use research. So technologies which could be both used for civil purposes as well as military purposes. And Israeli companies were included in that program. So we've seen a lot of money over the last years, in total for up to 70 million euros in funding, going from the security research program to the Israeli government, but also to some really, really problematic companies such as Elbit Systems, Israel Aerospace Industries, and IBM Israel, which are all Israeli arms companies which are heavily complicit in the genocide in Gaza.
I know, the topic we cover today is really heavy. It is not only terrible to witness a genocide. Finding out that the EU is playing a role in it, and the different ways it is doing so, is unacceptable. I think it is normal to feel hopeless. But we don't have to. There can be a way out. And it is through social mobilization.
So we've seen that our governments lack the courage to take decisive action to stop what's going on, to stop its complicity in what is going on. And I think it's really, really important that across Europe, millions of people have mobilized, have taken to the streets, have protested at arms factories, and have called for boycotts. And of course, the student movements are really important and have played a crucial role in the last couple of months. And that is having an effect. So we are seeing that more and more Israeli researchers have to drop out of EU research programs, and that this is having a detrimental effect on this kind of technological base and industrial and military base of the Israeli state. So, for example, an internal Israeli Ministry of Intelligence report from April said that the growing wave of European boycotts is posing a risk to Israel's scientific technological position in the world, and in the long run, this could lead to damage to national security and the strength of Israel's economy. So even the Israeli government is acknowledging that these student protests are having an effect and might damage its economy and its capacity to wage war.
As long as the people in Gaza continue with their struggle, we have no other choice but to continue with our struggle, because it's one of the same.
As Jews, we believe in standing in solidarity with all oppressed peoples everywhere. But as Zionist governments and organizations are using our Jewish identity and our traumas to justify the humanization and slaughtering of Palestinians, we have a particular responsibility towards them. For us, it is a mitzvah, a responsibility, during these high holy days to continue to work the work of solidarity, of resistance, speaking out, and holding ourselves and our communities accountable.
So, to conclude, a massive thanks to the Anti-Zionist Jewish Alliance in Belgium for sharing their footage with us. We dedicate this episode to all the people that are standing up against this hypocrisy, to all the people who speak up about the fact that what is happening in Gaza is genocide. It is for the students, for the workers, for the boycotters, for the academics and for the researchers. It is for the Jewish people that say, not in my name. It is for the Palestinian people that, no matter what, continue resisting.
And that's a wrap for today's episode. I'm Chiara from Counterbalance, and I want to thank you for joining this conversation on EU Watchdog Radio. If you enjoyed it, be sure to share it far and wide with your network. Also, do not forget to follow Corporate Europe Observatory on social media to stay updated on their work exposing how corporate influence over EU decision making fuels today's crisis. Thanks again, and see you next time.